first of all, to the Pelosi visit, there are people trying to judge, has this done more harm or good? What's your judgment on that?
It's funny because Pelosi this morning couldn't answer that question
herself.
So she's been giving a press conference in Taipei, to which some journalists asked, well, what are you expecting to achieve from this visit? And actually, because the cost has been quite high, China's been carrying out live fire exercises around the strait.
Jets buzzing across the straits.
Exactly. Yeah. And Pelosi actually couldn't answer the question. So I think the problem is that a lot of this is great as a signal of American support and all of that, and, everyone should be standing up for freedom and democracy. At the same time, is this really the best way to do it whilst provoking Beijing? And as you were saying earlier, at this time.
Yeah, and I suppose the West's response would be we shouldn't be prevented from doing what we think is right just because we're fearing the wrath of Beijing. That being said, nobody wants to start World War III, and it's an overstated phrase, but I mean, it's not insignificant to see Chinese fighter jets being scrambled yesterday, these military drills now being carried out in the Taiwan Strait. Just give us a sense of the background to all of this, because a lot of comparisons being made with Hong Kong and obviously the British involvement there and China wanting to reclaim it. But this is a different situation altogether on the island of Taiwan.
It's slightly different, but in the root cause, I would say it's the same, which is just the century of humiliation that the Chinese talk about, that my country went through under colonial powers, not just the British, but also the Japanese and other forces. And Hong Kong, is one of those places that got returned in 1997. But Taiwan hasn't been reunified in the Chinese mindset. And so it is a reminder to those in Beijing, to President Xi, that his job is not done, essentially. He talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. You can't greatly rejuvenate the Chinese people without reuniting all of your territory, at least in his mind.
So is there a parallel with Putin? And Xi's looking towards a third term, that he wants to be seen as the strong man, and he's looking at all these legacy issues to as he would say it, reunite a greater China. And that's a very dangerous thing in geopolitical terms.
Yeah, absolutely it is. There's one difference, though, which is just that Taiwan, it has been a flourishing democracy. Now, I'm not a Russia expert, but Ukraine has had less time being a flourishing independent state. And so the task on China's hands is much tougher. The military task is also much harder because it's an island. China has to be better at joint operations, that land, sea and air operations that it's trying to do better at, but so far hasn't really cracked, really. So it's a much tougher task than just marching over some ground.
Yes, so in many ways, the democratic norms that were established in Hong Kong are not respected by the Chinese, might have to be respected in the case of Taiwan, just because they've had longer to establish them.
Well, we'll have to see. I think before what happened to Hong Kong under the national security law over the last few years, there were people in Taiwan saying, look at one country, two systems. That does work for Hong Kong, and therefore it can work for us if we were to go back to the People's Republic of China. Now that argument is much harder to make, considering what's happened to Hong Kong.
Yeah. A lot of people are thinking, are we in now a new Cold War? And if that is the case, what is the relationship between China and Russia? Because clearly there was an indication that China wanted to pull back after the Ukraine invasion, thinking this could cost us in economic terms if we seem to be too closely allied.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the position has been reversed between the two. China was the junior partner in the original Cold War. Now, Moscow needs Beijing more than Beijing needs Moscow. And I think that's what we've seen, because China hasn't had to go support Moscow. Moscow can't force it to do anything, whilst at the same time, Beijing is making the most of the cheaper oil from Russia, whilst sitting on the fence on either side. So I think
it's playing its cards quite cleverly in that case.
Absolutely, it's taking advantage of the situation. And I also think that with the Russian invasion, that China wasn't really warned about it. You can see it was wrong-footed at the beginning, from statements from the foreign ministry, from the government. For the first few days, China didn't know what the narrative was, because until the invasion, it was, oh, this is just America warmongering. This is just
so a bit of frustration with that, then.
Yeah, and they had egg on their face, essentially, because they didn't see it coming.
And in terms of, Nancy Pelosi's visit and not really being sure quite what she's hoping to achieve, one wonders if any British politicians were to follow suit, who that might be. We've been talking this morning about how the Foreign Secretary is pretty busy at the moment, but we'll have an outgoing Prime Minister who's done very well in the Ukraine situation and got a lot of international praise for that. What do you think would be the response from Beijing if perhaps, say, come September, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson were to make a visit there?
Well, that would be an even bigger story than what we're talking about now, because Nancy Pelosi, after all, is not in the administration, and Boris Johnson would be making a pretty clear statement if he were to do that. I think it would
But would it be quite
unlikely.
powerful if he were to do that?
Again, it's the timing, it's what is it practically you're actually hoping to achieve. Everybody knows that the West is on Taiwan's side. It's just a question of how are you going to deliver that message? I do think we could see someone who was a bit more junior, someone like Tom Tugendhat, for example, who's chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. He's got an interest in China. He's got a higher profile through the leadership contest. And there has been talk that backbenchers like him might go. And that would be also, I think, a similar level to what we're seeing now. But anyone in the current government or going would, I think, trigger probably the next crisis in the Taiwan Strait.